it's associated with Biddeford and in New England particularly. I've always been fascinated with it since I was a little kid. And well, once I started teaching in Biddeford at St. Andrew's School, and his sister came to me and said, you're going to teach this course, and this social studies course. Well, the state says you've got to use this book, or you've got to have a section on Maine history. And I said, really? Okay. And she gave me a book. And it was George Folsom's 1830 publication of the history of Biddeford and Saco. And it's fascinating. So I got the kids involved in a whole bunch of projects, and we had a remember the bicentennial in 1776? Some of you were obviously old enough to remember that. We created a museum, which Daniel is a part of. Daniel is our, Montaigne is our treasurer now, and a board member of the Historical Society, and he does a fantastic job. So I'm following his lead, which he did, came up here, and he did a program on the churches of Biddeford, which was fantastic. So I've got some big shoes to fit right now as I move on here. So if I could, for a minute, just talk a little bit about this whole thing of this myths and reality, is that this particular time period, this is part one, by the way, and I'm only going to deal with really the exploration period. I'm going to talk about geography. I'm also going to be talking about the early colonization and also the Indian Wars. And I'm pretty much going to leave off with that before we get into the period of the American Revolution, which will be in the next section if I do another one. So I think you can see what this says. It says, the land may vary more, but wherever the truth may be, the water comes ashore, and the people look at the sea. That was by Robert Frost, one of the great American poets. And I think it's so emblematic of what we have here in Biddeford. I can't imagine. I've been up and down coasts in Florida and here, in North Carolina, South Carolina, and so forth. And I think Maine, and a lot of people believe it is the most spectacular coastline in the United States. We have the longest coastline, believe it or not, if you were to walk it by miles, from Canada to New Hampshire. We have the longest coastline in the United States, except for California. Florida. I'm sorry, Florida. Yeah. So that tells you something about what we have here. Biddeford is a nucleus of historical and cultural activity that's been taking place here for thousands of years. So let's take again here, I'm going to try to see which one I got. Yep, okay. So geography determined the life of humans in Biddeford, even to this day, as it does across the globe. Of course, back during the colonial period and exploration period, there was the elements, natural elements, were even more of a challenge to the people than they are today. Today we can go into our warm houses, or we can drive our cars with four-wheel drive. We can turn the heat up or shut it off or turn the air conditioner. Back then they couldn't do that. Back then they had to tackle with what was presented to them by Mother Nature. So these pictures here that I put up here are part of our collection from the Historical Society, which I had pointed a bit ago. And this is actually the points here at the top. This is the southern tip of Biddeford, down at Timber Island. If you haven't made the trek down there and hiked out onto Timber Island, then I hope you do so, because it's beautiful. And that's the southern tip. So it reaches out, and then you can look in towards Goose Rock Beach. And then there's Timber Island, which is also a part of Biddeford. These are the slides here. Of course, I've got a picture of Stage Island, which I'm going to talk about later on. And all across here is beautiful, beautiful scenery. One of the things was, though, as beautiful as it was, these were formidable challenges that were placed into the hands of the people who first settled here. They had challenges where they lost their lives to the cold, to the surf. Yes, hello, good morning, guys. They lost family members to other extremes. But as you can see in these scenes here, you know, we have this incredibly beautiful landscape and seascape that is really unparalleled, from Cape Cod to anywhere else. You know, the rocky shores of Maine have been, you know, the artist's delight for centuries. Here along the coastline, this of course is down in Biddeford Pool. This is also Biddeford Pool down what we call East Point, Wood Island Lighthouse, Biddeford Pool itself, Milestretch Beach, and the Saco River. So the Saco River really is what makes us who we are. Because if there was no Saco River, all we'd be like Walboro. Or, no, we'll get my buddy Ryan Lindsay's from there, and he'll be here shortly. But it's a coastline, it's jagged and so forth, but there's no river in which there's this unbelievable amount of human activity that's going up and down the river, applying for over 7,000 years. You know, we're pretty cool, 2023. When we look at 7,000 years ago and what people were doing, it was amazing. So the enduring Saco I wrote here from the White Mountains to New Hampshire to the drainage basin of Saco Bay. Now that's approximately 60 miles or 65 miles the way the crow flies. It's over 150 miles if you were to canoe it. Not to get ahead of myself, but when Richard Vines, who was the founder of Biddeford in 1616, when he made his trip up the Saco River in 1642, he went from the Saco River to find the headwaters because he heard that there was gold or silver that was still in their heads. You know, why they were coming here? Gold, silver, and gems. Now, nada. But what he did find is he found unbelievable forests and water power and potential. It took him 15 days to canoe from the mouth of the Saco River over the falls, all the way to New Hampshire. He camped out with the Native Americans who were out there. At that time, the Sepokai who were up there, not here. And then he came back, and in 15 days. That's nothing compared to what the Native Americans did. So I'm going to do this quickly, because I might bore you. But really, we have some periods here in terms of the geography or geographical concern or makeup of what happened. We have the volcanic period and into the Ice Age. The volcanic period is when literally the planet Earth was just this molten sort of yucky guck surface. And then what happened is it went into a cooling stage, and this is millions of years ago, billions of years ago. And out of that, volcanoes came, and they created the mountains. Now, the oldest mountains in the world are the Appalachians, which extend all the way from Canada to border, almost the border of Florida, to Georgia. And those mountains are, if you notice, very different from, say, the Rockies or the Himalayas. They're not sharp points. That's because the next stage was the Ice Age. The Ice Age came in which the surface of the planet Earth in the northern hemisphere, not all of it, the northern hemisphere was covered by a sheet of ice. In some areas it was over 20,000 feet thick. And across these mountains here, in the Appalachians, it ground them down. And then it took the debris from those mountains, and as it melted, it dropped it down. That's why you could be walking out in Clifford Park, or you can be going along the roadside, and you see this big monster rock. How the hell did they get it? Ice dropped it. You know, it's part of the ice drop. And it's the same thing along the coastline. I just read the other day and I realized that much of the sand that we have was actually pulverized rock as a result of the glacial period. I thought that had taken place during the time period of the extraction of the glacier and the grinding of stuff underneath it. Most of that beach sand is millions of years old, and it's made up of multiple types of materials. But what happens is that after the Ice Age, by the way, does anybody know which mountain has a portion of it that in the state of Maine has only about a 5 square foot area that stuck up through the glacier. It was unaffected. Anybody guess? Mount Katahdin. Yeah. Right up there at the top of Mount Katahdin, you can find it. And scientists know, because they can go over and test the ridges and so forth. Nothing hit this. That's right. So what happened is, as the ice flow came out across, I'm going to go to the next slide now. As the ice flow came out here towards the coastline, as it receded, it had already plowed all of this debris out and created a debris field which extended all the way from Canada to Cape Cod, and that's out there today. You look at charts of the ocean near the Bay of Fundy and so forth, you'll see that debris field that sits there, right there. Those are some Grand Banks and that sort of, those are some of the greatest fishing grounds ever in the history of the world, which eventually would be pretty much fished out. So, after that, the soil, at some point, microbiologic action created soil, which soil is basically part sand and roughing, whatever else, vegetation. It's deteriorated or it's recreated itself into a humus, into something that is limited. And that's what was left here. Now, all along the Saco Valley, we have one of the richest areas in the Western Hemisphere. That sounds, and I'm not pulling that out of my hat either. It really is. The soil is split, much of it is clay-based, which my friend back there and I found out the other day again when we were moving one of my mowers that got stuck. But during this time period, all sorts of fauna, vegetation, microbiologic action creates this Garden of Eden, so to speak. And for thousands of years, it was on its own, and it flourished. And all of a sudden, people came in. Well, where the hell did they come from? And oh, where? Well, we learned this, that all of the Native Americans, of those who have not had relations with Euros and created children by way of those relations, all those people were of Asiatic origin. They parted the Great Migration across the Bering Strait, went down across the western side of the United States, down just all the way to Central America and to South America, and lastly, they made their way across south of the southern United States and started moving up. We are one of the last places in the Western Hemisphere that was populated by human beings. And when they got here, they became known as the Red Paint people. We know they were the Red Paint people because we found their graves, and they were buried in red ochre, and we know their trinkets. We know how incredibly gifted they were. They built birch bark canoes, we know that. And they went 20 miles out to sea because we found the remnants of their sword fishing bills. I don't know if you've ever seen a swordfish out of the water on a deck. It wants to kill you. I don't know how they could go out there in a 20-foot birch bark canoe, 20 to 30 miles out to sea, with a man on the bow going and stabbing a swordfish, and then dragging it on board, and then getting 10 more, and then coming back. It was amazing. There was a professor at UMO who wrote a book on it, and it's a really good read. Well, the Red Paint people here vanished. We don't really know why. We don't really know why. We know that their culture ended at some point. The next group we'll call the Old Algonquins. Here's when we start to come up with the labeling by way of language. Language is the general language, it's Algonquin. And these people here were more like present-day humans, or I guess whatever you want to call them, modern people. And we found also that they were very adept at their standard of life. The old Algonquins went by the wayside, and they were replaced by the Abenaki, who were really part of the Algonquins today. Algonquin, again, is a language group. Abenaki is one of those language groups, sub-language groups, called Abenaki. And then beneath that were tribal groups. Okay? And the tribal group that was here, the mouth of the river, at the time when Samuel de Champlain, the first Euro who came here and recorded it. Now, there were others who were here before, They're fishermen. By 1588, the fishing in Europe the fishing stocks were collapsing. They'd already fished it out, all the way up to Norway. And things were here, they were coming over here in not 92, it was, anyway. John Cabot was sailing in an exploratory course in the 1490s off the coast of the Gulf of Maine. He counted 10 vessels from foreign countries from Europe that were here fishing. And they were still not talking about it. This is the time period when Columbus was finding America. And he's out there scaling a line and he's saying, hey, we're catching fish. Yeah, great. No, they're not catching them that way. You know? And what they did with them, there were two ways. Later I'll talk about what the English way did, which was actually better, is that they took and they made brine and they gutted the fish, threw them in the barrels, back to Europe, and so forth. So the people that were here, this is Saco Bay. This is our area, our neck of the woods, as people say. This is the Saco River. Here as it goes out, with all these islands dotting. Stratton Bluff plays a major role. Richmond Island is from here, actually to Cape Elizabeth up here, all the way to Wood Island. So this is our bay right here. It's about 7 miles, I think, across and maybe 3 miles wide. Prout's Neck, and then the Sandy Beach. This beach is the largest sandy beach in the state of Maine. This pool, Biddeford Pool, here is this green area, this marsh area. It's the largest tidal pool in the state of Maine. Okay? We are so many things that are special about this area. And the Native Americans who came here next, okay, the Abenaki, flourished. So what do you do when you want to keep somebody away from the fishing grounds? You scare them. You know? So this is a picture here, a depiction in the 1600 thereabouts, and it was, or even before that. And it's a depiction of what you would be up against if you went to this place to the west. Your ship is going to be eaten. There are sea monsters that are going to eat you. They fight with each other. It's a whole place. It's hell. Devils are out there. Everything else. And people say, okay, I'm staying a long way from those places. Of course, St. Bernard the Navigator, he came here on a high boat and made it back to Ireland and in 1066. It's a long time before that. And he came over here, went back and wrote a book called Navigatio, and he documents it. And even today, Tim Severn and I would retrace this trip came over. That didn't have the effect that the other explorers were going to have. There were still plenty of people who wanted to be here in this Garden of Eden. So healing Europe was propelled to action and Renaissance. And this is where we are now. In the end of the 1500s, by the end of the 1500s, the early 1600s, the Black Death is gone. If anybody's ever read about the Black Death or anything, it was horrendous. It makes the, COVID seem like a common cold. Cities were wiped out. And it wasn't just because of that, there was big problems also. The cities were filthy. Sewage systems went into canals. London was a mess, and other places were. But once the Black Death ended, all of a sudden there was some beginning of a newness that was taking place. They were renewing themselves. Christianity, for one thing, the new forms of Christianity, and even the old forms, were talking about a good life. Actions dominant in Christian beliefs fractured the old major faiths and causing an explosion of theoretical social thinking. So you have all these people coming up with many, many different ideas. How will we get to heaven? What do we have to do? And then, of course, the Black Death was subsided, as I mentioned. And now, the fear of death and monsters and supernatural forces, we see enough of that on television. We see enough of that in theaters and so forth. And we know it's all poppycock. But in reality, for these people, that was real. And it was waiting desire for earthly pleasure and dominance and newfound lands to the west. So this one more, I'll go quickly here. The terrain, the forest, the river, the sea. The struggle is with climate. Horror stories stymied the first attempts. In 1607, a group from England, George Popham, was the leader of this particular expedition, was sent by Sir Ferdinand Gorges to come to Maine. He owned Maine. If you own 25 acres, you got a lot of land, right? He owned the whole state. He had a grant from the government and from the king, Charles II. He was a royalist. Poor Ferdinand was going to get caught up in one of the great conflicts in English history, the English Civil War, when Oliver Cromwell took over. And then we have the introduction of the Puritans. They take over Massachusetts, of which Maine is a part of. So you know what's going to happen here in the long run. But before that happened, the struggle, they had to figure out what were they going to do. Well, Popham came here in 1607. It was a disaster. They went back in the spring. Half of them died from disease, hunger, and even at war with the Native Americans who were there. They looked at them and said, these guys are coming in, they're intrusive, they gotta go. So in the spring, Raleigh Gilbert, son of George Popham, who died, got a group of his men and they sailed back to England. And when they got back there, they said, don't go there. Nobody here, no Englishman will live there. Ferdinand Gorges was not stunned. He took it and said, well, I don't know. He was fascinated with the whole principle of coming over here. So he sent Richard Vines in 1616 to come here to this place along the coast. Find me a place. So these are some quotes here about the weather. I cannot command wind or weather, Horatio Nelson. We can adjust the wind, but we cannot adjust our wind, but we can adjust our sails. Human manipulation. In Maine, if you don't like the weather, give it a minute. We know that, right? Yesterday is a little different than today. Climate is what we expect, weather is what we get. As humans, we are in a constant struggle to appease the gods and strangle the clouds. Native Americans and colonists. Well, first of all, the contact period, when they were just meeting one another, some of them went very well, some of them didn't. As a matter of fact, many of the people in that Popham colony were saved by Native Americans. They were able to go back to England with the help and aid of Native Americans. Others didn't. What do we do? Well, in John Cabot mentions 1497. He was the one who sailed here and recorded and came back with some pretty interesting ideas. Samuel de Champlain comes here in 1605. Champlain is kind of a hero for me because when he came here, he went to a place along the shoreline at the mouth of the Saco River, and he said, let's go see what's there. And he couldn't get in because there's a sandbar at the mouth of the river. So he turned around and he went over to Stratton and Bluff Island, and he anchored in the middle. Now, Rob and I are both sailors. We've been sailing here for years and years, and with Murray, we're all sailors. We know there's waters out there. We know where not to go. And we have a little race at the end of the year. We sail around Stratton and Bluff Island. We won't go in the middle. I keep thinking I'm going to try it, but not yet. But that's what he did. And they anchored, and then they rowed to the shoreline at the mouth of the Saco River, and they met the Native Americans. These are his words. I'm not going to say it in French. And he said, after we had cast anchor, a large number of Indians came toward us on the bank of the river and began to dance. Their chief, whose name was Panamuchin, was not then with them, but they arrived about 2 or 3 hours later with 2 canoes and went circling around and round our pinnace, which is like a large dory. And he said, our Indian interpreter could understand only certain words in as much as language on the Amachiqua. That's the first time we ever hear that word stated. It's the Amachiqua, which was the name of the Abenaki people that were here at that particular time. And anyway, differs entirely from that of the Siracuas or the Etchemans, The Etruscans were pretty aggressive against the explorers. These tribes ruled in farther north in Maine. These people, Champlain says, these people showed that they were much pleased. Their chief was good-looking, young, and active. We sent some goods on shore to barter with them, but they possessed only their clothes, which they bartered. For they made no provisions of furs except to clothe themselves. The French were after the furs already. The Sieur had certain articles. He was in charge of the French colony to the north, of whom Champlain was employed by. Had certain articles given to their chief, with which he was much pleased, and he came on board several times to visit us. These Indians shave off their hair fairly high up on their heads and wear the remainder very long, combing and twisting it very neatly behind in several ways, with feathers which they fasten on their heads. They paint their faces black and red, like other Indians we have seen. They are an active people with well-formed bodies. Their weapons and spears, clubs, bows, and arrows. At the end of these latter, some of them fasten the tail of a fish called a cygnon, horseshoe crab. And they use that for others to use bones, while others make them entirely of wood. What they did is that they cultivated the soil. That's my garden around here I put in every year. That's actually called the Three Sisters. There's corn, there's squash, and there's beans. And that's designed out or planted on the design of the Native Americans. And that's how they did it. I haven't put any fish in there though, because I'll see a bunch of creatures that'll come by, I'm sure. They till and cultivate the land in practice we had not seen previously. Ah, that's huge. Because what that is saying right there is that this is the furthest extent of intense agriculture of all the people in North America. Right here along the Saco Valley. Everything to the further north. Other explorers or other people, Euros, would describe them as hunter-food gatherers. They did grow some tobacco and some other things. But here, these people had a fantastic diet, along with the fish and the wildlife. The river is called by the inhabitants of the country Chocoy, which turned into become known as Saco. The following day, the Sieur went on shore to view their fields upon the bank of the river, and I with him. We saw their grain, which is Indian corn, yellow corn. This they grow in gardens, sowing 3 or 4 grains in one spot, after which, with the shells of the aforementioned cygnon, they heap about it a quantity of earth. Then 3 feet away they sow with as much again, and so on in order. Amongst this corn they plant hillocks, 3 or 4 Brazilian beans, later called bush beans, which come up of different colors. When fully grown, these plants twine around the aforementioned corn, which grows to a height of 5 to 6 feet, and they keep the ground free from weeds. We saw these. There were many squashes, pumpkins, and tobacco, which they likewise cultivate. The Indian corn we saw was then 2 feet in height, and there was also some 3 feet. As of the beans, they were beginning to burst into flower, as were likewise the pumpkins and squashes. They planted their corn in May and harvested in September. We saw there a great many nuts, which are small and have several divisions, probably hickory nuts. And yet there were none on the trees, but underneath we found plenty from the preceding year. We saw also many vines, on which were exceedingly fine berries, and from these we made juice, of which they made wine, of course, the French, right? Well, there's more to that. I would encourage you to do this. Stories of Biddeford by Dane York. If you haven't got a copy, get one. And it's an easy read, but it's fascinating. Because Dane York was a librarian at MacArthur Library for many years. And I never met him. He had passed away by that time. That I came into the scene here. But Dane York was quite a guy, and he wrote this beautiful short history of the area, and using a number of different resources. So Champlain comes here. George Weymouth shows up, an Englishman. He gets into all kinds of trouble with the Native Americans, hijacks 5 of them, brings them back to King Charles. One of them was Squanto from Plymouth. Brought him back, and then he made friends with him. He showed him off. They actually got into a battle with some Portuguese or Spanish soldiers, and they hooked them and they took them away, and they put them in prison. And then finally, the English government was able to get them back, and they made their way back here to North America. But John Smith was another great admirer of him. These are the vessels that they used back then. They're called caravels for the most part. This is the workhorse of the age of exploration. What it did on these vessels did, which was great, is they used triangular sails along with square rigs. So they had speed with a square rig, and they had triangular sails so they could get deeper into the wind. And that was an invention that occurred all the way down onto the Nile River. We thank the Egyptians and Moroccans and others there of that. And then the Europeans finally got on board with it. So, 1616, what happens is that, you probably heard the story, is that Vines comes here in June of 1616, and he goes into the outer harbor of Biddeford Pool. And he spends the winter here. He's an agent that is hired by Sir Ferdinand Gorges. And Gorges says, listen, I want you to go over. Okay. So he was a physician also. I don't know how great doctors were back then, but he was a physician. And he was also a sea captain. He was also a farmer. So he had a whole bunch of things, and he was very literate. So he got a crew together, and they came over, and they sailed into the mouth of the Saco River. And contrary to what Weymouth said, what Popham said, as an Englishman, said, this is fantastic. So they spent the winter, and they went to an area which is called Lightning's Point today. Down by Bridge Street, there's a monument here that shows that particular point where he spent the winter with the Native Americans. And in that spot, unfortunately for Native Americans, the remainder of the Chippewa from 1605 were dying in heaps. And contracting diseases, measles, common cold, smallpox, malaria, and others. And yet, they welcomed these Englishmen into their wigwams and allowed them to spend the winter with them in safety. They gave them food. And Vines tried to help them. He tried to help them, but it was to no avail. They were literally stacking bodies into piers, so they had to burn them because they knew that they had to get rid of the bodies. So that was a disaster for them. So Vines goes back, though, after his rencontre here of the area, and he tells Ferdinand Gorges, he says, it's great, we go back, it's okay. So Vines now, he's the great proprietor of Maine. And he says, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a chunk of land, and you're going to then take the patent, and you're going to divide it up into whatever divisions you want, and bring surveyors with them, and you're going to then sell it to people who they will rent it for 100 years. And they have to pay a fee, which came out to be something like $5 in our currency. So all came back in 1630, By that time, the Native Americans were gone. Okay? Now the Chippewa had died. And this didn't just happen here, it's happened all across the globe. It's still happening in places where Native people are being decimated by Euro diseases, or Western diseases, or whatever. So I put down here economic possibilities. These are things that were driving people to escape England. Fish, huge. Timber, they had white pine. Hadn't seen anything like this in England 5 centuries. Pine trees that were 6 feet wide. They went up into the sky. It was incredible. Water power. This was a major source of the pre-industrial revolution, was water power. Granite, stone, harborage, places where you could go in and you would get out of the storm. Places like here, the mouth of the Saco River, or Cape Porpoise, or the mouth of the Kennebec River. Kennebec River is a tough one. You don't really want to go in there for a while. But then other small harbors along the coast down here. Stage Island Harbor down here, Stage Island Harbor, Stage Island, what the hell is Stage Island? Why do they call an island Stage Island? Any guess? Stages were basically for fish platforms. And what they did is they put tables out with slats, and they would come to their fish after going out there and they caught fish, split them, cut them open, throw them onto this, and they would cover them with salt. And they're all along. There's stage islands all along the coastline. There are ram islands all along the coastline. You know, there's cow islands all along the coastline. But there are very few Negro islands. And here in Biddeford, there's a Negro island. And nobody really knows for sure, as far as I know, and as to why it's called Negro Island. And I'm not really going to go there because I'd like to find out. I think we could find out because it's on charts. It's been on charts, Admiralty charts, and it's been on navigation charts for years and years and years. Seaweed, another very, very important part of the life there. Furs. You know, this is something that is much, and thatch. So thatch was what was growing down along the banks of the Saco River here, and out in Biddeford Pool, all along this water. Thatch was used for roofing. It was extraordinarily important. It was so important that the thatch bed that's in the middle of Biddeford Pool today is still owned by the city of Biddeford, and if you want to go out there and harvest thatch and make a roof of it, you can do so. Okay? That's on the books. This is a vessel. Well, one of the things that came out of Popham was they built the first ship. I have to put this in, it's important. The first sailing vessel built in what is today the United States of America was this vessel in Popham. And they called it the Virginia, after the Queen, their favorite Queen. And it was this one. This is a model of it, and it was built last year, 2023. They just launched it, and they're sailing it. This boat sailed, the original one, sailed back and forth at least 5 trips from here to England and back. It's not a big ship, you know, yeah. So, when Vines came back here in 1630, he, am I getting along here? Is this time? I don't know, we're over time. 7:15? Okay. So, when Vines came here, one of the first things he did with his colonists is he had what they call the twig and turf ceremony. And he went down to the shoreline and he said, okay, this is going to designate this chunk of land for you, Mr. Lightning. And okay, and he took a piece of turf and some twigs and presented it to him and mixed it together, and that was a sign, symbolic of way back in the old West. And then they got to work, and boy did they get to work. This right here is a sawmill up here, and you can imagine it's a pull saw, right? Both sides. The guy up on top is pushing, the other guy down is pulling, and then he's pushing up, the other guy is pulling, and that's how they did it. They did not build log cabins, okay? And they probably initially lived in structures that were similar to the Native Americans in forms of wigwams, which is here. You know, there was an arching structure, something like a Quonset hut, and then it had bark on it, spilled out, and that's what they lived on until they were able to build what they felt was a suitable home. But you can see on the right, these pictures came from this book also that Dan York put in. It's simple. They show you also wooden chimneys. You know, that's a bit dangerous. Yeah. And later, of course, they built them out of stone for obvious reasons. But you know, not many windows. If they had any windows, all they used was oiled cloth. You know, they didn't have glass. Matter of fact, there's a number of paintings here which go back to the colonial period. I don't know if some of these windows were actually originals, but they're imperfect. And when they brought glass over here, they brought it over here in small pieces. Because you know what happens when we're on ships if you get big pieces of glass. It shattered. So they used that as a means. These guys didn't have that. The unfortunate part, I'll go back here quickly. So Biddeford then begins to get developed during this period from 1630 into the 1640s, with Vines as the head. And this, you can read about this on your own. But eventually, because of the English Civil War, his Lord Proprietor loses all of his property because he stayed on the side of King Charles II, lost his head. Probably heard of that event. And then Sir Ferdinand Rogers dies penniless. In the meantime, he had already sent over his nephew, who was going to be his spokesperson. Poor guy never made it here. And he's really the father of Maine. People think that Maine was, how it was named, there's a whole thing about that. But anyway, what happened is that his son, Thomas, came over here, and he became the proprietor of Maine. And within Massachusetts, Massachusetts by the 1640s is now taken over by the Puritans completely. And they've got some really strict rules that you better go by. And this did not go along with the Anglicans who had things in religion that were still baptizing people. Matter of fact, there's a baptismal basin that was in one of these churches that was here in Biddeford. There was one down in Northern also church. And it was used to baptize children. They didn't do that. That basin was over at the museum in Stockholm. Also, it was a communion plate. That was not something that the Puritans did either. There's a communion plate over there, which is reminiscent of the Anglicans. So right away, what happens, you got a conflict, a religious conflict between those that have been here for a while, have settled, have built a church, and so forth. You notice this one, very simple. This is what you would have walked into. There's no stained glass, there's no crucifixes, there's no statues, and no holy water, no blessing yourself, And Danny made the point when he was doing his presentation is that a religious service lasted for all day. Sitting on these kinds of seats. Okay, horsehair. These are very old, by the way. Very comfortable. You know, but you cannot take one of these home. Alright? So what happened is that the Civil War stuff came back over here. And eventually, Vines got so fed up with stuff, he said, I'm out of here. Now, Vines never kept journals. They were right in it. It's unfortunate. He ended up going down to Barbados. He bought a sugarcane plantation. And he became a slave. You know, like a lot of them. Eventually, when he died, he was buried in the Anglican Church Cemetery, which was blown away in a hurricane, or fell apart, and the cemetery was lost. We don't know where it is, but he's somewhere. But he was a really very, very good leader. During his time as a leader, the court systems that were here, we literally had courts that were set up that prosecuted people for swearing, for bad behavior, drinking. Okay, it was a big problem. Well, one guy, Richard Bonathan, was arrested, not arrested, but he was fined 2 pence or 3 pence for dandering the minister's wife. Now, dandering, exactly. That's because he was eyeballing her, or he was doing something disrespecting her. And he got penalized for it. There were people here in this place who were arrested for things like not getting their trees out of the new roads that were being constructed. Roads. All you had to do was have a road, was to have something that you could take your man and a horse. That was it. No buggies, whatever else. If you didn't get your lumber out of there in 10 days, you're going to be fine. I imagine today somebody fell in church in one of the roads in Biddeford. You get 10 days to get that out of here. Right? No. So things were different, but they really did get along with one another for the most part. Now the colony, or the pact, of Vines was shared by Richard Oldham. John Oldham. He was in Rhode Island. He was killed in an Indian battle in Rhode Island. Never made it here. So Vines ended up getting both Biddeford and Saco. And they gave it the name Saco. Eventually, it would divide into two towns. And this side kept the name Saco. And that side took the name of Pepperborough. And there's reasons it's going to come up about that. Well, the Indian Wars, this was a crucial part. And part of this, I have the info in this, is that there are a number of stories that have been sent out there about, for instance, Squando. Everybody know heard the story of Squando and the Indians, canoes, took it over and stuff. We don't even know if that's true. We do know, though, that Squando was a tribe. By this time, the Sokokai Indians, who were out to the west, they came in and they were trying to take over where the Chippewa were. And they were competitive with Native Americans, with the English settlers. The single most difficult thing that the Native Americans did not understand were boundaries. They had no boundaries. It wasn't like, this is my land here, and that's yours. They didn't do that. So what happened is that they got in the way, and they got shot, or they got killed. And in the courts, it's in there, in the records, that the person has the right to do that for Native American. But also, is that they had hunting parties where they had Washington Town down in Kennebunk. And one day they went out and they had over 100 men with their rifles, and women were behind them. And they walked through the woods and they shot everything that popped out in front of them. And then people picked them up, put them on wagons, brought them back, and they made a giant stew which they ate for I don't know how long. It's in one of the books I've read about Kennebunk poison. Those people down there are different. Believe me. But actually, there was a battle going on when they were building this road, the Guinea Road. So here, this, by the way, was the original road. The Guinea Road was built not because my Italian friends would be insulted by it, but it was because that cost, I think, 5 guineas to build. It wasn't a road, it was just a pathway that went from here, from this parish meetinghouse, to the parish meetinghouse in Kennebunkport. So that was that road. You can take it today. And going over the same pathway that was made in the 1600s, 1600s, late 1600s, early 1700s. Unfortunately, what did happen is that in September of 1675, involved with the King Philip's War. King Philip was a Native American in Massachusetts with the Wampanoags, and had an uprising. And they had enough of the English. You got, we're going to kill them all, we're going to get rid of them. And it didn't work out well for them. And that spread, though, all the way up here. Native Americans joined forces, like the United Nations of Native Americans. And up in town, which we now have 2 villages. The village down in Biddeford Pool, or Winter Harbor, named after Richard Vines. And we have the Falls Village up in town. And the Falls Village is emerging as becoming more competitive and has more. They're taking care of what the resources are up here, the timber, the flowing water for their grist mills, and their woolen mills, and their linen mills. There are no cotton mills. Nothing like this yet. That's the next, that's top 2. So what happens down in Biddeford Pool? Fishermen. Fishermen, and clanmen. I had a friend of mine built a house down in Biddeford Pool, Roger Garney and his wife Irene, and when they were doing the land, it was up behind the Haley house, which I'm going to show you a picture of. And in those fields, when they were plowing up the area for their foundation, they came off tons of clam shells. Swimming, and I said, geez, I didn't think this was underwater at one time, up here. And they said, no. It was Tad Baker, was the state archaeologist, knew that's because they ate so many clams, Native Americans. And it's clam-based. You guys have been to a real Indian clam bake? Awesome. Okay, seaweed, fire, throw the seaweed on top of the fire, put all the fish, clams, lobsters, everything on there, cover it with tar for about 5 hours, and it's unbelievable. But anyway, what happened is that exploded this war. And the first battle, we actually know the battle, we know the day, right up here where Mike's Market used to be, Pool Street Market, right in that area, there was a garrison of Captain William Phillips. He became a very, very important person in this area. Particularly, he owned most of it. He was the recipient of most of what Vines had in Biddeford, and then he was going to sell to other individuals later on. Well, anyway, he was also the first casualty. He got shot by an Indian in the shoulder. Didn't kill him, no, but he got him. And in the end, they were able to repulse the Indians, and they were able to make it down to the shoreline at the falls and down the river and out, and everything here was almost wiped out. During the Indian Wars, there were stone forts that were constructed up in town, and where the mills are today. Someone told me he remembered when there was actually remnants of the stone fort there. I don't know if that's true or not. And then there was one at Fort Hill, at the end of Hills Beach. Very end of Hills Beach, at the top of what we call Fort Hill, there was Fort Mary. And that was a place that was manned until just after the War of 1812. So this area was hotbed. And for that time period, there were a number of wars that were fought, named after the kings of England and so forth. But the only war that was fought that was basically Indians versus settlers was the first one. And all others after that were connected to the French and Indian Wars. And the French got involved, and we battled it out. This is a burial stone here of Captain Samuel Jordan. Samuel Jordan was quite an individual. He was captured by the Native Americans. He spent 10 years in captivity. When they captured you, they didn't torture you, they put you to work. Or they took you in as their family. He learned the language of Sokokai. In 10 years as a kid. And then he finally got away. He came back and he became a negotiator. He became a warrior, a fighter. And he also ended up being awarded this gravestone in the park. This is right down by UNE. And that gravestone was sent by the English government as a commemoration of his loyalty to the crown and the good things that he did. This is the Haley House. Now things are going to change. They're a little different from the ones that were here in the 1600s. This is by 1715, 1719. I've seen those dates, both those dates on this house. This is the end of the Indian Wars as far as Biddeford. The wars would go on up until 1759 in other parts of America. But here in Biddeford, it was over. So these are the kinds of houses they were building. Here's one of the myths, is that this particular structure, there was a battle that was surrounded by Indians, and the women were inside, and they ran up and down the stairs, and so forth. That didn't happen here. This house wasn't built. It did happen up in the Falls Village, though, in one of the structures that was up there. So there was, though, I think it was Thomas Haley, who was killed by Native Americans. He was out in his field, and he was going to get his favorite cow, and he heard the bell. This is the myth, whatever, the story, and he was peppered with arrows, they found later on. Not a good way to go. But that whole area down there is just teeming. And one of the things I love about it is that when I drive along there and going out to do properties, to take care of properties and things, I'm driving on the same pattern of road that dates back to the 1600s, because that's the back border. It's the western border of the properties that were divided up by the original colonists here in 1630. And I know that that road is one of the oldest roads in the United States, the way that it winds and turns and so forth. You see on the left, that's actually a modern picture of it. There's an addition to the back of all the fancy windows and so forth. This was basically a salt box design. One of the wealthier people would be able to buy something like that, build something like that. They had a huge chimney going up through the middle of it to heat the whole house. And on the right is the same house. A picture was taken of it previously. So you notice that clapboards, Shingles were not the outer skin of houses back then. It was clapboards. You know, it was easier for them to make, and so, but anyway. And in town, in the village, this is what's taking place. Seth Springs Tavern. You know, Seth Springs Tavern is here in Lumberyard. You guys are laughing about something.
No, that's where Lafayette stopped.
Yeah, that's where Lafayette stopped, right? 1825. Stayed there, yeah. But before that, during the American Revolution, it was a place where people were coming all the time. George Washington was supposed to go there. He didn't show up. He didn't go further north than Boston because he said, New England is ridiculous. The roads are horrible. I'm serious. Washington was not a fan of New England. But anyway, of course, this is the building. And if you look at the windows, anybody know why the windows on the top were smaller? It's two. One, ventilation purposes and for attics, and the other was you didn't have to pay the taxes if you had small windows like that. That's what I've heard, but that's maybe a myth.
It still looks the same.
Yes, I know, it's wonderful. So one of the earliest artistic renderings is in Saco Falls, 1825, by W.S. Gookin. I used to work for his great-grandson. Cut his lawn up here on the pool road. And Vincent Gookin, the character in that. But his great-great-grandfather did his painting in 1825. Okay? And this is what it looked like. Those are the falls. If you go up the river and you go to the left of the island, which was originally called Indian Island, then it became Saco Island, then it became Cuts Island, then it became Factory Island, and now it's back to Saco Island. So, yeah, that's off to the right, and off to the left, look at that. There's a guy with a fishing rod standing there and fishing. This picture, I took this from Downs' book. He was a professor when I was in college at St. Francis College. Great guy, great man. This photograph here is also by a Gookin. It's the son of the guy who did the painting before. And this one here shows you the falls of Biddeford. So this is Biddeford. I know you really can't see it very well, but it's really cool because you go into McCarthy Library, it's right up on the wall. You stand in front of it and look at the names. These are the houses, if I can get up there without pulling this up. Like 1825 to 1860, they say, but this is the river as it comes down, the Saco River. It divides itself. This is Factory Island here. Comes in and around, and then it goes out to the ocean. I'm sorry, it's coming this way. Coming this way here. This is Saco River here. So this is Saco, Biddeford, and this is Factory Island, or Saco Island, whatever you'd like. So there are places along here that you can see when you go look at it. You can see there's mills. There weren't textile mills like, there weren't brick ones. There were small ones. And a lot of those were lost, and then they were rebuilt at the end of the Indian Wars. Two villages joined by the meeting house, this structure, or whatever was here. Because the people who lived in the Falls Village had no church, and the people in Biddeford Pool had no. Everybody came here. Danny, how many people did you say they could fit in this structure that was here? And you said it was what?
Originally?
Yeah.
I don't recall.
Yes, you do.
I don't.
Wasn't it something
Was
like
it
over 1,000 people?
800, 1,000?
Yeah, 800 to 1,000 people inside of the building. Yeah. So this building replaced it in 1840. This is Biddeford 1875. Things have changed. It's amazing. Think about that. 1830, 40 years later, you've got Oz. And there are places on here that are, you would recognize to this day. One of them, though, is something up here. Which they did is they needed a water supply. Fresh water here, salt water, or brackets can't drink that. So what do you do for all those people that are coming? City of Biddeford, now we've gone into the industrial age. Right here, they built themselves a reservoir, brick-lined reservoir. I'm going to kill myself. Let's see. A brick-lined reservoir that was up where the fire department is today. And then, why they put it up so high? Because the pipes ran down. No sewer system, though. I'll talk about that in part two. So this is the bottom of the hill by St. Andrews, by Rory's Boatyard. And this was a shipyard site during that time period. They started building ships. The largest vessel that was ever built here was 180-something feet long. It was the Mount Washington. And it was a 3-masted clipper ship that went out the Saco River. This is the waterfront in 1870. You can see the factories are in the background. I took that in the bank. It was a picture that was in the bank, but I've seen it, we colorized it. Here's another view of the waterfront here. Going back quickly, Sir William Pepperell. Not everybody who's a sir or one of nobility and wears fancy clothes is a nice person. He was a pretty good guy. Actually, he was the benefactor of Saco. He did a lot for Saco. Matter of fact, that's where they built the church, the schools. They had a big plot of land there. He owned more land than Saco anyway. He also was in charge of the expedition that defeated the French at Louisbourg up on Nova Scotia, the fort up there. And he was given a sir. He was knighted. He's the only American, the only person born in the United States who was given the title of sir. He became a knight. But he also was a major shipbuilder. A major shipbuilder during this time period. One of the things that they were involved in was this, the triangular trade, which is a sad rendition of humanity. Because this, to not even talk about it is something we want to be done in our country today, makes me infuriated. But the triangular trade was basically a system in which natural resources were transported from one place to another. Those natural resources for us is going to be timber, for ships, and so forth are going to be built off to England, right? And then also, we're going to get our molasses, which are made from Rome, off to England. And then from here, so where did we get the sugarcane from? From the West Indies at this time. Not really in southern United States. The West Indies, the islands. Many of them were denuded of their forests so that they could put in the sugarcane fields, like for instance in Haiti and elsewhere, Barbados. So this is where they grew the sugarcane and they made it into molasses, came here, rum, and across. The dark part, the worst part, though, is Africa. Now, I know that we've all seen films, like, or some of you remember Roots. I remember watching that when I was in college. One of the first films that came out really hit home about the slavery issue and so forth. But slavery was a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. And nobody could ever put a defense of it as it was something that was necessarily necessary. Because even when you think about many of the products that were being transported, like by rum or molasses and stuff like that, when you got the money, commerce, and they dehumanized. Africans sold Africans. There's no question about it. There were black Africans in Africa who went out there and extracted, and they went there. The average, I forget the name of the fellow here he did a presentation here not long ago. He made the point of the average age, or average life expectancy of a slave on a plantation in the Caribbean was 7 years. 7 years. You're on. They were replaced. Had more of them. Horrible. Well, Pepperell and other people who ate at big dinner tables, had big mansions. I mean, the mansion that's built down there in Kittery today, that was built by money. That was part of the slave program. As was others all across America. The thing that's going to change it here, in our country, where slavery is going to expand. It was here already. 1619, a group of 20 Africans were sold in Jamestown, Virginia, as permanently indentured. Unlike here, where you could sign up in England, and you could indenture yourself with somebody for 5 to 11 years, and you were basically part of the family, or you were a slave, or whatever it was, But once that was up, you were free to go. Many people took advantage of that, that position, because it was not a great place to be over there. And there were, during this time period also, at the end of the Civil War, they're not building weapons and all this stuff anymore. So where are all these artisans? Where are they going to go? They don't have any work. Came here. But the issues were part of something that was in our history. We have to recognize it. And even in Biddeford, how many African slaves were here in Biddeford? I don't know. I know that in Maine, and I was looking at the numbers total, compared to what was taking place in other parts, it was small. But there were. And there was actually a village where they had in Kennebunk, which was just found a couple of years ago. They still haven't noted as to where that was, but they found a place where there was a village there. There are names like Island, the island, Negro Island, has a name that's derogatory towards blacks. And, or it was, on charts, it was listed as that. So this subhumanity thing existed here and went on. But there are also people who were here and they were working and they're living and so forth. So I've got some pictures here, some slides I'll just show you. This is Church Point, which is right up here on the Saco River. This, I had to put this in. My mother-in-law has this in her kitchen. And it was in her house down in New Jersey. But the old man is sitting here himself. Look at the size of the fireplace. That's what they had. That's they baked their bread. They made a lot of stews, a lot of different kinds of stews. And I was reading about plum duff, and I was reading about some of the other corn meals that they made. I hope everyone enjoyed yourself, and thank you so much for coming and supporting.